So I'm going to cover quite a bit of ground today. This is the outline. I won't read it to you because you can read faster than I can talk, and it will save me time going on. But a lot of this will be, I think, familiar to many of you, and I'll go through it pretty quickly. But I will post this on my website at Harvard, and I suspect the APS will find something to do with it as well. So if something goes by too quickly, you'll be able to find the deck and look at it. So let me start with the variety of roles in which scientists and engineers have opportunities to speak science and technology to power. One set of roles are those associated with full-time employment in a government. In the United States, those opportunities in the federal government include White House offices, the Office of Science and Technology Policy and others, executive branch departments and agencies. You guys, you folks know the list. Working in Congress as representatives and senators or as staff members. We have an acute shortage, by the way, of physics PhDs in Congress at the moment. I believe there's exactly one. Bill Foster from Illinois. We used to have two when Rush Holt was still there, and at one point we may have had three, but it's pretty dismal. We need more. But there are also staff positions, of course, that scientists can take, engineers can take, including congressional fellows positions, and of course there are positions in state, city, and regional governmental entities, not just the federal government. Those positions can be short or long-term. A lot of scientists and engineers take positions in the National Science Foundation or the Department of Energy or OSTP for a couple of years and then go back to their other lives in the lab or in the classroom. Or they can be long-term positions, obviously, and some scientists and engineers make basically their whole careers in government positions. There are also a whole set of roles as part-time but still formal government advisors, members of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the National Science Board, the JASONs, the Defense Science Board. There are science advisory panels at virtually every government agency that has significant science and technology missions, although under the Trump administration, some of those advisory panels have disappeared. There are a whole set of opportunities to interact with policy as members of panels of the National Academies, Science, Engineering, Medicine that provide inputs to government. My first experience providing input, aside from one congressional testimony in 1969, was serving on the National Academy of Sciences Committee on International Environmental Programs in 1970, which was advising the Secretary of State on what the United States position should be in the upcoming 1972 Stockholm Conference on Environment and Development. And that led to a whole set of other academy assignments, which were opportunities to interact with policy. And of course, members of advisory groups at other levels of government are possibilities. There are also a whole set of what you might call ad hoc advisory opportunities. Folks from academia, industry, civil society who get invited to testify before congressional committees or to provide advice to congressional offices or executive branch departments in informal ways. People who volunteer their advice by writing to government officials, visiting them in their offices, hosting them at your own institutions. People who take part in formulating and representing the positions of non-government organizations. This organization, the American Physical Society, the American Chemical Society, the Ecological Society of America, the AAAS, Union of Concerned Scientists, all of which engage in activities intended to influence the government and sometimes succeed in influencing governmental policy. And of course, writing articles, blogs, op-eds, or letters to the editor that are aimed at influencing policymakers. I actually spent 38 years as a researcher and a professor engaging with policy in those part-time roles before I finally, in January of 2009, took a full-time position in science and technology advising in government. Let me talk quickly about the interests and responsibilities of the federal government. I'm going to focus on the federal government now, even though these opportunities do exist at other levels and many of the principles and practices are very similar. But I want to draw on the 8 years I did spend in the Obama administration and stick now with the federal government focus. And I start with why science and technology matter to the federal agenda. I think this is pretty obvious, probably to everybody in this room, that science and technology and advances in science and in technology are really essential for advancing almost every item on the national agenda. Not every policymaker realizes this. I was very fortunate that President Obama did realize it. He understood how and why science and technology matter in all these domains, and that was a huge asset to me, and I think to the nation, to have a president who basically got it in terms of the importance of science and technology. And of course, one should not leave out the notion of science as one of the activities that makes us human and that lifts our spirit through discovery and invention and expanded understanding. And again, very interesting thing about President Obama is he got that too. When he, just a few months after being inaugurated, spoke to the annual meeting of the National Academy of Sciences, April 2009, becoming the first president since John F. Kennedy to do that, he spent about 60% of his talk talking not about all the applications in the top part of this slide, but talking about the importance of fundamental science, which was very gratifying. And I didn't write all of it, by the way. He wrote a lot of it himself. Key point, these are all wholly or partly public goods, which means that they won't be adequately secured without the government's engagement. The private sector is not going to attend to all of the things that need to be done in support of all these aims. It will contribute to some of them, but it won't do all of them, and the government needs to be there. Most basic research in both natural and social sciences is done in universities. That funding is provided mainly by the federal government. More than half of the funding for basic research comes from the federal government. Most applied research and development get funded and performed by private firms. Overall, if you look at the total R&D spending in the United States, it's like 70% private sector, 28% federal government. So the federal government's role is biggest in the basic domain, smaller in the early stage applied science, smaller still in late stage applied R&D, and smaller still in development. But the government has important roles in shaping policies that can either encourage or discourage private sector R&D. So the government does have some influence over that 70% that's funded by the private sector, in addition to the funding the government itself provides. But it's also, and this is very important, it's also government's role to devise and implement programs to bring science and technology to bear on public goods that are not adequately addressed in the marketplace. Obviously, those include national and homeland security, public health and safety, environment, education, justice, and you could make a longer list. The machinery of making federal policy for science and technology is quite elaborate and complex. Science and technology policy is a shared responsibility of the Congress and the executive branch. The overarching Congressional Science and Technology Authority is in the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. For one period of time, some of us called it the House Anti-Science Committee, but never mind. The Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, and relevant appropriations committees and subcommittees. But a lot of other committees also have roles, and there's a list of them here. Pieces of science and technology policy are sitting in the jurisdictions of all these congressional committees. In the executive branch, a lot of players. Most of you, I think, will recognize most of the alphabet soup that is represented here. The Department of Defense, including the National Security Agency, NSA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Health and Human Services, of course, includes the National Institutes of Health, but also the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Food and Drug Administration. Department of Energy includes the National Nuclear Security Administration, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, oversight over the national labs. Department of Agriculture, the Agricultural Research Service, the National Institute for Food and Agriculture, Department of Commerce, in the view of many, oddly enough, has NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which includes the National Weather Service. It has the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office is in the Department of Commerce. So Commerce actually has big responsibilities in science and technology policy. Department of Interior has the U.S. Geological Survey, and so on down the list. And again, the list could be made even longer, but these are probably the executive branch science and technology actors outside of the White House that are the most important ones. Now, let me say just a couple of words about the need for science and technology advice in the White House. If you think about the wide range of competencies in science and technology that exist across all those executive branch agencies that I listed a minute ago, and obviously the president has the capacity to call on people in any cabinet department, the cabinet secretaries, their various deputies, anybody he wants. Question arises, why does the president need a separate science and technology advisor and a supporting office inside the White House? Indeed, some of you may be amused to learn that when I would go to receptions and cocktail parties in Washington, D.C., and people would introduce each other and say, well, what do you do? And I would say, I'm the president's science advisor. The most common response was, why does the president need a science advisor? What do you actually do? And so some of the slides that follow are actually slides I developed for the purpose of letting people know why the president does need and have a science advisor. The first thing is that if you don't have a capable scientist/technologist on the president's senior staff, he and his other senior advisors in the White House might not even recognize the relevance of science and technology to policy choices that are before them. And it's a very common phenomenon that all of you who have been engaged in this kind of activity, I think, are already aware of. And that is, if a scientist or engineer is not at the table, the chances are that important connections between science and technology and the policy issue at hand are not going to be noticed. Opportunities are going to be missed. You think about the task facing a president. President might not know when he needs to ask a science question of an agency. And if he does have an idea that he needs to ask a science question, he won't know who in the agency to ask or what question exactly to ask. And that's something that the science and technology advisor in the White House helps with. One of one's responsibilities is to know what the capabilities are in the departments and agencies and who is knowledgeable about what and how that might be applied to policy questions at hand. So that's the second point here. You really need specialized knowledge of the science missions and competencies to assist the president and indeed the vice president in that role. But the third point is that it's often helpful for the president to have an independent source of science and technology advice, independent of the particular agendas of agencies. So if the Secretary of Defense comes to the president and says, if you would just triple the budget for ballistic missile defense, we could have a bulletproof shield over the nation in a decade. Good for the president to have a science advisor who is not bound to support that agenda. The president can say, is it really true? Could we have a bulletproof shield over the United States in a decade? The answer, of course, is no. But again, that might not be the story that the president is getting from the relevant cabinet agency. Same thing for the Department of Energy. If you would just triple the budget of the National Ignition Facility at the Livermore Lab, we could have commercial fusion in a decade. There was actually a senior person in the president's office making that claim. The president called me up and he said, come see me in the Oval. This claim was just made to me. I find it highly suspect. I know you, Holdren, worked in fusion energy for a long time. Please come and explain to me exactly what's going on at the National Ignition Facility and how close we are to commercial fusion energy. That was after some publicity flacks at the Livermore Lab had announced they had achieved energy break-even with NIF. And in fact, what they achieved is more fusion energy out than the energy that reached the fuel. Problem was that there was 400 megajoules in the capacitor that drove the lasers, And of the 400 megajoules, 10 kilojoules reached the fuel, and 12 kilojoules of fusion energy came out. So they were still factors of tens of thousands short of true energy break-even. But never mind, President was knowledgeable enough to call up his independent science and technology advisor and say, I've just been fed this story. And by the way, it was not either of my good friends, Steve Chu or Ernie Moniz, who fed him that story. They would never have done such a thing, but in any case. So, science and technology advice in the Obama White House. Obama, in his first inaugural address, said, we will restore science to its rightful place in my administration. And that was a reaction to some of the things that had gone on in the previous administration, particularly where it was quite clear that political considerations were not just sometimes, which is inevitable, but virtually always overriding science and technology insights. The place of science and technology in the Obama White House was centered in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. I was dual-hatted as not just OSTP director, which is a Senate-confirmed position, but assistant to the president for science and technology. That title is what is commonly and colloquially referred to as the president's science advisor to the president. But it is that title that confers direct access to the president. And that title is not Senate confirmed. The president is entitled to appoint his own senior advisors without the consent of the Senate. So you have this odd situation that half of you is Senate confirmed and accountable to the Congress, and the other half is not Senate confirmed and only accountable to the president. But the importance of that, not every president has made the OSTP director assistant to the president. George W. Bush did not, and my predecessor, John Marburger, was director of OSTP, but he did not have the title assistant to the president, and that meant he did not have direct access. Assistants to the president are the only people in the White House who can make an appointment with the president or who can send a memo to the president without anybody preventing it, interfering with it. If an assistant to the president writes a memo, the president sees it. If an assistant to the president asks for an appointment, the appointment happens. Everybody else, deputy assistants, special assistants, don't have that access. And White House office directors don't have it unless they are simultaneously an assistant to the president. The OSTP sits obviously within a constellation of other White House offices. Some of the most important ones are listed here. And as I'll note, active collaboration goes on between the OSTP and all of the entities that are listed here in that diagram. So putting science in its rightful place entailed a number of actions that Obama took immediately. One, he appointed the first ever chief technology officer, and as he had promised in his campaign, made the chief technology officer also an assistant to the president. And the chief technology officer and supporting staff sat in my office, OSTP, but only reported to me administratively because the CTO was assistant to the president, had the same rank in terms of access to the president as I had. He appointed the first ever chief information officer, the first ever chief data scientist. He restored the full complement of 4 OSTP associate directors. The legislation that created the Office of Science and Technology Policy specified that the office was entitled to not only a Senate-confirmed director, but 4 Senate-confirmed associate directors. And traditionally and historically, those have been an associate director for science, an associate director for technology, an associate director for environment, and an associate director for national security and international affairs. In the preceding administration, they basically demoted 2 of those 4. So there was no longer an associate director for environment and no longer an associate director for national security and international affairs. One might uncharitably assume that was because President George W. Bush was not interested in advice about environment or about national security and international affairs. So those positions were held by assistant directors, not Senate confirmed. And one of the things that when I was discussing the possibility of taking a job in the Obama administration with the president during the transition, he said, what would you want if I appointed you to this position? I said, I would want to be assistant to the president, and I would want to have 4 Senate-confirmed associate directors again, and that happened. We built up the OSTP staff from the 45 at the end of the George W. Bush administration to 135, a tripling of the size. That was not because we were working 1/3 as hard. It was because Obama gave us about 6 times as much work to do as our predecessors had had. We re-energized the Interagency National Science and Technology Council. I'll say more about that in a minute. The president quickly launched and empowered a new President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, which was really extraordinary. 3 Nobel laureates in science were appointed to the new PCAS. 2 university presidents, the vice presidents of both the National Academy of Sciences and National Academy of Engineering. Both of them happened to be women. The executive chairman of Google, a former associate director of OSTP for Environment from the Clinton administration, a former undersecretary of Energy from the Clinton administration, and many more. It was really an extraordinary group. I'll say more about that too. And perhaps most importantly of all, the president made clear to his cabinet and all the senior officials in the White House that he wanted science and technology officials at the appropriate level to be at the table for policy discussions where there was even a possibility that science and technology would be germane. And that was extraordinarily important in terms of the influence of OSTP and across the cabinet agencies. Because the president told his cabinet, I want science and technology at the table in your policy discussions. So basically, the Science Advisor and OSTP have had 3 clusters of responsibility, historically and certainly under Obama. These first 2, this reciprocal pair, science and technology for policy and policy for science and technology, that formulation is due to the late, great Harvey Brooks, professor at Harvard, who was widely regarded as the godfather of science and technology policy studies as a scholarly focus. Science and technology for policy, is indicated here, means providing insights from science and technology that may be germane to whatever policy issues are in front of the leadership. And policy for science and technology has to do with all the things in the second paragraph. One of the very important ones is working with the Office of Management and Budget, preparing the president's budget proposals for R&D across the departments and agencies, but there are a lot of others. STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math education. Scientific integrity and transparency. The use of science and technology to improve the operations of the government all fall in that category. And the third responsibility is basically serving as the president's emissary on science and technology to 4 different constituencies. The executive branch agencies with science and technology responsibilities, the Congress, the non-governmental science and technology community nationally and internationally, and foreign government officials. The idea is to explain to those constituencies what the administration is trying to do in science and technology, with what policies, how we're trying to do it, and to listen to them in terms of what advice, complaints, cries of outrage they might have about the administration's science and technology activities. OSTP had a wide range of other responsibilities. One, of course, was developing interagency and multi-sector science and technology initiatives in support of the president's agenda. One which I didn't realize until I got there is OSTP provides the White House oversight of both the National Science Foundation and NASA. Those 2 very important science and technology agencies are not headed by cabinet level positions. So their heads are not in the cabinet room. When the president meets with his cabinet, they are represented by the OSTP director, who is in the cabinet room. Carrying out a range of classified functions in support of national security and emergency preparedness communications, and some other classified functions. We called that the dark side in OSTP. All that work taking place in SCIFs, sensitive compartmented information facilities. Providing science and technology support to all those other White House offices, to the National Security Council, to the OMB, the National Economic Council, even to the Director of National Intelligence and the U.S. Trade Representative. These are all White House offices, and OSTP is expected to support them all as needed with science and technology expertise. And by the way, that doesn't all come from the people who actually work in OSTP. Part of the function is, again, to know who across the departments and agencies could be called on with relevant expertise. And if that's not enough, to whom should we reach out in the wider science and technology community? To the academies of science, engineering, and medicine, to different universities, to civil society organizations, and so on. And finally, we had the responsibility for overseeing U.S. science and technology cooperation with other countries in partnership with the State Department. National Science and Technology Council, really big deal, responsible for all of the science and technology activities that cross agency boundaries. That includes the U.S. Global Change Research Program, $2.7 billion a year, 13 agencies. That sits under the NSTC. The National Climate Assessment, the National Nanotechnology Initiative, the Networking and Information Technology R&D Program. These are all multi-billion-dollar enterprises that cut across departments and agencies, and so they are organized, supervised, overseen by the NSTC. The NSTC comprises the deputy secretaries and undersecretaries of cabinet department that have S&T missions, the heads of all these other alphabet soup agencies, NSF, NIH, NASA, NOAA, and so on. Nominally, the National Science and Technology Council is chaired by the president. In practice, the president delegates that authority to the OSTP director. So all these things really sit under OSTP. 5 standing committees: science, technology, environment, natural resources and sustainability, national and homeland security. And we added STEM education. There were 4 standing committees before Obama. Now there are 5 because we added a standing committee on STEM education. And all those standing committees have multiple subcommittees and task forces and panels doing the work of developing and overseeing these interagency initiatives. Just to give you a sense of the range of NSTC activities, in the course of the Obama administration, the National Science and Technology Council published 90 reports and strategic plans. Some of the topics are listed there. You can see it's a very wide range of topics. And they also convened interagency task force activities to support issues arising. The Ebola response, space weather, which the president became very interested in, geomagnetic storms, which could take out, in the worst case, big chunks of the electricity grid. Federal science and technology workforce capacity building. And the NSTC produced recommendations for policy development and implementation on all those topics. You can find all the NSTC reports, all 90 of them, in the Obama archives at this website. OSTP also managed the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. That's a set of people who, except for the President's Science Advisor who co-chairs it, all the others keep their day jobs. They come from academia, from industry, from civil society. They keep their day jobs. They advise the White House on a part-time basis, and they link the President and the OSTP to the wider science and technology community. Obama PCAST had 20 members. They're all, except for the President's Science Advisor, special government employees. That means they're uncompensated except for their expenses. And the other co-chair comes from the outside group. And administrative support for that was provided from OSTP. That's the first term members of PCAST. As many of you will recognize some of the faces. President announced them at the meeting of the National Academy of Sciences in April 2009. That was the earliest, I think, that PCAST had ever been announced. And he met with them, and he met with them often. Over the course of his 2 terms, his PCAST produced 38 studies of science and technology topics. This is the distribution of the topics. But more than the number of reports, this was a remarkably influential PCAST because it had a receptive president, and he embraced a large fraction of the recommendations and made them into policy. And we'll talk about some of those very shortly. But this is a typical meeting of President Obama meeting with PCAST. Across the table from him is my PCAST co-chair, Eric Lander, the director of the MIT Harvard Broad Institute for Genomics. And I sometimes say in this picture, Eric has his mouth open as usual, but Eric always had very salient things to say, and the president loved him and valued his advice, as he valued the advice of the whole PCAST. Some other entities which OSTP managed: the National Ocean Council, which I co-chaired with the head of the Council on Environmental Quality, responsible for implementing national ocean policy; the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, which I chaired. NSC had the vice chair of the National Security Council, coordinating all Arctic activities, not just science and technology, but all of them. And again, the president's making his science and technology advisor the chair of this was another indication of his understanding that science and technology are relevant to virtually everything that goes on in the Arctic, not just research in the Arctic or energy technology for the Arctic. Council on Climate Preparedness, Resilience, and Adaptation. I co-chaired that with the head of the Office of Management and Budget, the Homeland Security Advisor, and the chair of the CEQ. We had an Emerging Technologies Interagency Policy Coordinating Committee, co-chaired with the head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in OSTP and the U.S. Trade Representative, addressing the intersection of science and regulation. And I was responsible for being the U.S. chair of the 6 bilateral ministerial level science and technology cooperation commissions, and the 6 countries with which we had those relations are listed there. Meetings back and forth between the 2 countries, overseeing all of the government-to-government science and technology cooperation. So you begin to see why we had 135 people in the Obama administration. And finally, I co-chaired with the Chinese Minister of Science and Technology something called the U.S. Dialogue on Innovation Policy. Here's a picture of one of our meetings. The person on my left is Minister Wan Gong, a mechanical engineer and transportation expert who became the Minister of Science and Technology at the same time as I became Obama's science advisor. And the wonderful thing was that Wan Gong and I had been running a joint research project since 2002 between our 2 universities on clean and efficient vehicles in China. And so we were good friends and close collaborators by the time we both were made the top science and technology officials in our 2 countries. So Obama did a lot of other things to keep his pledge, early priority on all of these issues. And all of these were assigned to OSTP to advance. So I had the responsibility for developing new scientific integrity policies, for developing new open data policies, and so on through the list. He used the bully pulpit in the White House venue a lot to promote science and technology. I think Obama talked more about science, technology, STEM education, STEM inclusion more than any other president in history. Virtually every major speech he gave, he talked, among other things, about science and technology. He hosted 6 White House science fairs. There'd never been one before. These were assembling in the White House kids who had won science fairs, robotics competitions, rocketry competitions, math competitions, and they brought their poster boards and their devices that they'd built to the White House and spread them out all over the East Wing, and the president crawled around on the floor with the robots. He's got a lot of publicity. But we had a lot of other events in the White House around science and technology, as indicated here. Here are a bunch of them: Astronomy Night for Kids on the South Lawn, welcoming mathletes, winners of National Math Competition for middle school in the Oval Office, the first science fair, honoring outstanding K through 12 science teachers, picture of them visiting MIT's Energy Lab. This was a president that was really into it on these issues. He launched an extraordinary number of initiatives, many of them recommended by PCAST, or the National Science and Technology Council, focused on this very wide range of national and global challenges. And here's a partial list of specific initiatives in these domains that the president launched. And again, all of those can be found, what they actually contain, they can all be found on the website. Number of things we didn't get done. We had a goal that the president announced in that first speech in April 2009 in the Academy of raising the sum in public and private research and development to 3% of GDP, which was higher than it had ever been. It had been 2.9% at the height of the space race. Would have entailed raising government R&D to about 1% of GDP and incentivizing industry to reach 2% to get the total of 3%. We had a big boost early on in the Recovery Act, more modest increase in 2010, but budget caps prevented further growth. And it took almost 7 years of trying to get Congress to make the research and experimentation tax credit for the private sector larger, simpler, and permanent. It had been a goal from the beginning, part of incentivizing the private sector to do more research. We finally got it done in December 2015. At the end of the administration, we were at 0.75% instead of 1% for federal R&D. We did get to 2.05 in the private sector, so the total was 2.8. You see the long-term evolution of federal non-defense R&D, the bump from the Recovery Act, 2009, and some of the money spent in 2010, and then the budget constraints imposed by the Congress and reluctantly agreed to by the president so we could have a budget at all, led to barely being able to hold the line at a somewhat reduced level. We didn't get a nationwide price on carbon emissions, even though we would have loved to. Cap and trade bill passed the House in 2010, never got a vote in the Senate. Once the Republicans took over, it was clear we weren't going to get any congressional support on climate change. Interestingly, when we established the target that the president announced ahead of the Paris conference, the U.S. target to reduce emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 by 2025. That was based on executive actions only. Our modeling showed you could get there with executive actions and no help from the Congress. But our modeling also showed, and this was never announced to my knowledge, the modeling also showed that if we had a moderate carbon tax in addition, then that target could have been 32 to 33% rather than 26 to 28. We didn't fix high skills immigration policy, even though we wanted to. Obama's immigration plan, which he released in 2011, called for stapling a green card to every STEM graduate degree earned at a U.S. university by a foreign student. Couldn't get it done. That would have required legislation. Congress couldn't break the deadlock on immigration policy overall and refused to separate out the STEM component. So we didn't get it done. So let's turn to Trump. What he's done or proposed so far. He started off with a set of appointments of climate change deniers or wafflers. Waffler is a term I use for people who say, yeah, climate change is happening and humans have something to do with it, but it won't amount to much. And if it starts to amount to something, we'll adapt later. Mulvaney at OMB, who also famously said, even before his confirmation hearing, that he didn't understand why the government should spend any money on research and development of any kind. I'm sure the statement was true. He didn't understand. But in any case, a bizarre position for the head of OMB. Scott Pruitt and then Andrew Wheeler, a coal industry lobbyist at EPA. Ryan Zinke, and now another coal industry lobbyist, has succeeded Zinke at the Department of Interior. Will Happer, notorious denier, an otherwise distinguished physicist who has crazy ideas about climate change, has been installed at the National Security Council. That's an interesting challenge for Kelvin Drogemeyer, the head of OSTP. Drogemeyer is an atmospheric scientist who does understand climate change, but he has a counterweight on the NSC making all the wrong arguments. Trump rescinded every one of Obama's executive orders on climate change. Rescinded them all. The Clean Power Plan, climate change adaptation measures, both domestic and international, the calculation and use of a social cost of carbon in government decision-making, all gone. Proposed eliminating very important parts of our program of Earth observation and analysis. proposing to zero out the budgets for a variety of Earth observation and carbon monitoring satellites, cutting NOAA's ocean grants and programs by $250 million. He reversed many other environmental decisions from the Obama administration, some of them listed here. And most importantly, of course, in the environmental domain, announcing U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Accords, halting U.S. assistance to developing countries on climate change. At the end of 2018, the New York Times had counted 78 environmental rollbacks completed or underway at that point. And as of late January of this year, the Washington Post said their total of the false or misleading statements by the president since the start of his term were over 8,000. Quite extraordinary. Some things that have had perhaps less attention. The Trump administration has imposed changes on immigration and visa regulations and enforcement that have had impacts on science and technology. They've just not just had the impacts in the headlines, the human impacts on the border, but they've reduced the attractiveness and accessibility of U.S. universities to foreign students. They've made it more difficult and less attractive for non-U.S. citizens, STEM degree holders to come here or stay here. They've even hobbled foreign attendance at international conferences on science, technology, engineering, and math held in the United States. The Trump administration has drastically scaled back the area of Obama's additions to national monuments in the American West. And here's another, maybe more subtle but very dangerous one. Trump administration continues to load the federal courts with right-wing judges who will rule against environmental protection and conservation on public lands whenever they're given the opportunity. All of that, of course, has stimulated an exodus of a lot of talented people from the federal government who've been demoralized by those changes. Those losses have been particularly heavy at EPA and Interior. Got that already. This one I should have gotten rid of. It's a dupe. Sorry about that. Proposed big cuts in non-defense R&D. For the 2018 fiscal year, those cuts would have totaled 20%. He proposed a 6% cut at NIH. Congress, of course, didn't buy it. He proposed a $1.6 billion cut for energy R&D at the Department of Energy, an 11% cut at NSF, a nearly 50% cut in science and technology at EPA. He proposed increases on the defense R&D side so that overall total R&D under his proposal would have gone down only 5%. And here you can see that fortunately Congress reversed the Trump proposals overall. Congress is a great fan of NIH. They know that NIH works on curing the afflictions of members of Congress and their families. And so they were never going to accept a 20% cut in NIH, and they didn't. And Trump nonetheless proposed deep cuts again for fiscal year 2019, as shown in this illustration from the AAAS. But the good news is they gave up on proposing cuts for Department of Defense Science and Technology, for NIH, for NSF, and for NASA Science and Technology. They're still proposing a lot of cuts, but they started to get the message on things that Congress was not going to accept and did not bother to do this. Now, there are some bright spots. I would not want to give what could be fairly characterized as an unbalanced account. They kept Francis Collins as director of NIH and Franz Cordova as director of NSF, and that's great. Two outstanding scientists heading those very important agencies. They continued the Obama administration initiatives on advanced manufacturing, on cybersecurity, on biomedicine, the BRAIN initiative, combating antibiotic resistance, the Precision Medicine Initiative, now renamed All of Us, all those continued. High-capacity computing, the National Strategic Computing Initiative, has continued. But of course, they have not admitted that those things started under Obama. And that's probably good, because anytime President Trump notices President Obama's fingerprints on anything, he cancels it. And they finally appointed a capable director, Kelvin Drogemeyer, for OSDP. He was confirmed on January 2nd of this year. So what should we do? What should scientists and engineers do? How should we respond? I have some propositions. One, don't be discouraged. Scientists and engineers should keep doing science and technology. If necessary, seeking funds elsewhere if the federal government funding for what you're doing has been lost. Keep talking about your findings and their implications for policy. Don't be silenced. Get better at explaining the science and technology you do to lay people, not just what you know and how it matters, but how you know it. Very important to explain to people the basis of what we understand about science and technology, and explain the imprudence of ignoring it. When I first met Obama, when he was a senator, and we had a dinner talking about climate change, and Obama said to me, as we were sitting down, you know, this was, of course, in the middle of the George W. Bush administration, he said, you know, this is the most fact-averse administration in history. And it's imprudent to be fact-averse, is the point that scientists need to be making. I have argued for years, and others have argued before me, that scientists and engineers should tithe 10% of your time to public and policymaker education and policy and political activism. Serve in one or more of the part-time roles that I talked about at the beginning of this, providing science and technology advice to government. Protest the Trump administration's offenses against science, technology, STEM education, and reason. If you happen to still work for the federal government, probably not so wise to protest, and at least until you leave. Provide citizens and legislators with the knowledge that they need to defend respect for science in policymaking. And work to elect candidates to elective office who actually understand the roles of science and technology in society and the roles of government in supporting science and technology and using science and technology to inform their decisions. And of course, think about running for elective office yourself. Some people say that will amount to politicizing science and we shouldn't do it. That scientists and technologists speaking out will come across as just another interest group. I reject that notion because I think scientists and technologists are an interest group. We're interested in increasing understanding of ourselves, our world, our universe, and we're interested in using science and technology to improve material well-being, health, environment, security. That's an interest to be proud of. We shouldn't be embarrassed by being called an interest group. People argue we'll seem to just be worried about our jobs. I think the message should not be, please save our jobs. It should be, given what science and technology are and do, if government slashes funding, all of society will be the loser. Science, furthermore, is already politicized. Government's decisions about how to fund, assist, encourage, and use science and technology are made in the United States and most other countries through a political process involving executive branch agencies, legislatures, interest groups, and the public. And if scientists and technologists who know more about the stakes than anybody else absent themselves from these discussions, we have an impoverished policy conversation. Scientists have certainly no less right and responsibility than any other group to ensure that their voices are heard. So here are some last pieces of advice. If you're in a federal agency, work as closely as you can with technical staff in OSTP and OMB to defend your agency budgets. Take every opportunity to explain to relevant congressional committees what your operation does. If you're not a leader in a federal agency, keep doing your good work as long as budget and permission from above permit. Publish and present your findings, but let analysts outside the government link them to policy. But if your work environment gets too awful, quit and go public. Joel Clement did that. Joel Clement was the leading Arctic scientist in the Department of Interior. Secretary Zinke transferred him to accounting. Joel Clement wrote a blistering op-ed in the Washington Post and quit. And I hired him in our Harvard Arctic Initiative. Okay, I did this already. I should have got rid of that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John, for that very low-key and non-political presentation. I would like to entertain questions. Please come to the mics. This is being recorded. If you'd like to know who you are and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you very much. I have a question about the National Nanotechnology Initiative that you highlighted in your talk.
Right.
Given that it's been around for more than 15 years, I wonder if you could mention where you think that initiative should go next, in particular given the recent launch of the National Quantum Initiative. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. PCAST actually reviewed the National Nanotechnology Initiative 4 times in the course of the Obama administration, basically every 2 years, and made a number of quite pointed recommendations about how it should evolve to more effectively meet current needs. It did a terrific job early on in supporting fundamental research in nanotechnology, identifying a number of different domains where nanotechnology could make an important difference, not least in materials science of a wide variety of kinds. And those of you who study energy, for example, know that almost every energy technology is limited in the end by the properties of materials, and nanotechnology helps us deal with that, including in batteries and fuel cells, which are getting better in part because of nanotechnology. But the direction in which it should evolve at the age of actually about 18 or 19 now is in the direction.
Am I losing my? I'm sorry. In the direction of working to bridge the gap between fundamental discoveries and widely applicable applications. And I hope that will happen.
Yes.
So it seems that having policies that can survive an election, receive broad support, should be a value. What are the characteristics of policies that can survive an election?
Well, the most important characteristic of policies that can survive an election are policies passed into law by Congress. And the great weakness of what we got done in a number of domains in the Obama administration was that we got them done by executive order because we couldn't get the Congress to support them. And in general, what is achieved by executive order can be undone by executive order. This is actually why President Ford, in 1976, when he became president after President Nixon had dissolved the predecessor of OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology, had fired his science advisor and had fired the whole PCAST predecessor, which at that time was called PSAC, the President Science Advisory Committee. President Ford recognized, number one, that there was a need for these things, but number two, if they were created by Congress rather than by executive order, as had always happened in the past, they would be harder to get rid of. And Ford, who of course came from the Congress, had great connections in the Congress, persuaded the Congress to pass in 1976 a law that created OSTP, gave it Senate-confirmed leadership, gave it a whole set of congressional responsibilities, and that was crucial in the survivability of those characteristics. Now, they weren't all survivable. Again, George W. Bush took advantage of the fact that although 4 associate directors, Senate confirmed, were authorized, he didn't have to appoint them all. But most of it survived. The reason we're not getting more done on climate change is we had to do almost all of it with executive orders. The one thing we got the Congress to do was pass some increases in budgets for renewable energy and energy efficiency. But the key to survivability is get the Congress. The key to getting the Congress is having scientists and engineers speak up, run for office, vote, get your friends to vote. We got the House of Representatives in 2018, now we need the Senate. Sorry to be political, but it's impossible, I think, to talk about these topics without being political.
Yes.
So It is an observation that the U.S. government is often loath to choose winners and promote industrial policy in a way that is perceived as choosing winners.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we see China having a very integrated and top-down direction to their policies and R&D development and so on. Do you see a way for the U.S. to be more effective, or do you think it's necessary or desirable to do that?
Well, first of all, we have flirted with industrial policy over the years, and you're absolutely right that anything that is characterizable as industrial policy leads to strong opposition from some quarters of our political spectrum. I think the right approach is an approach that tries to shape the environment to support and encourage innovation. We did that with a number of measures, including a number that did pass the Congress in the Obama administration. We were accused of picking winners when the Solyndra collapse occurred. I think that is an unjustified accusation in the sense that any portfolio of innovation is going to end up funding some failures. If you're not funding some failures, you're not trying enough. You are presiding over a pedestrian agenda based only on little incremental steps that you can be sure of in advance will succeed. And so I think innovation portfolios, research portfolios have to be judged as portfolios, not one project at a time. That and shaping the environment so financing is available, building public-private partnerships, which we did a lot of in the Obama administration. And by the way, much of that does continue in the advanced manufacturing domain and in the biomedicine and public health domain. A lot of those partnerships that we started are still going. And I'm just as happy that Obama's name isn't on them because it is helping to ensure their survival.
So for graduate students who are interested in going into science and technology policy, I've seen a lot of information about fellowships to work in congressional offices, but in terms of working in an executive branch office like OSTP, are there particular pathways to begin a career in this area, or fellowships or opportunities?
First of all, the fellowship opportunities are terrific. The AAAS has science and technology policy fellowships, congressional fellowships. In the whole time I was in OSTP, I don't think we ever had fewer than 4 fellows. We had them from the APS, the ACS, the AAAS. Sometimes we had as many as 8 or 10 fellows, but they were spread across, and still are, spread across congressional offices on both sides of the aisle. These positions are enormously educational, not just for people who want their career to be in science and technology policy, but for people who want their career to be in the lab or in the classroom or in industry, but benefit from learning a lot about how science and technology policy work in the federal government. Those fellowships are great. They're not the only way to get into these positions. I will tell one very quick story. Very early in my tenure at OSTP, a young man appeared at the door and said, I'm a PhD student in science and technology policy at American University, but I want to get my hands on stuff. I will do anything, and I will do it for free. I will photocopy, I will manage the website, I will work with the communications office, whatever you want. And so we took him on. He was free, he was smart, he was energetic. After 6 months in which he demonstrated not only was he willing to do whatever was needed to get the job done, but that he knew an enormous amount about space technology and space policy and was helping me oversee NASA. So I said, we got to pay this kid. And so we hired him. And he rose to be our assistant director for space policy, then went off to work for Elon Musk, and is now an associate dean of engineering at the University of Colorado in Boulder. He got there not by getting a fellowship, by walking in the door and saying, I want to help.
Cool. Thank you.
Hi. So in your talk, you focused a lot on the role of scientists in advising policy. What are your thoughts on scientists directly entering the government, so actually becoming politicians with PhDs or with scientists education?
Well, there are two dimensions of this. Again, one are full-time positions in government other than elected office. And in fact, if you look at the trajectories over the years of the APS fellows and the AAAS fellows and so on, about half of them stay. And they become full-time government employees in the science and technology policy space and spend their whole careers doing that. And half of them go back into research labs, companies, universities. So that's one trajectory. The other trajectory is running for office. I think it's enormously important that we have more scientists and engineers and mathematicians in Congress. I'd love to have one as a president. You know, it's almost embarrassing how many presidents of China have been trained at Tsinghua University in engineering. Tsinghua, the MIT of China, located in Beijing. We've had one president, President Carter, who had at least a reasonable amount of engineering training in nuclear engineering at the Naval Academy. But other than that, we've never had a scientist or an engineer as a president since Thomas Jefferson. What's that? Hoover. Okay, sorry. You know, I sometimes said that President Obama was the most science-savvy president since Thomas Jefferson, but there's more science to be savvy about today. Thomas Jefferson was his own science advisor. Bill Kohlglaser, I see there.
Yeah, John, from your deep experience working on science and technology with both China and Russia, trying to engage with them constructively, and now with the challenges with both countries, what's your advice on how we should be engaging with China and Russia?
The short answer is carefully. I should mention that question comes from Bill Kohlglaser, who was the executive officer at the National Academy of Sciences for many, many years and knows a lot about this. When I had to go before Congress and testify on our collaborations with Russia and with China, what I always said, and I think it's true, is that we're very strategic about those collaborations. We collaborate on issues that are clearly in the mutual interest of those countries and the United States. We collaborate with China on influenza, and by doing that, we get 2 or 3 months extra notice about the characteristics of the bugs that are coming, because they all originate in that part of the world. We collaborate with China on nuclear reactor safety, because a nuclear reactor accident anywhere is a setback for nuclear energy everywhere. We collaborate on a variety of domains in fundamental research with China and Russia, because by collaborating, we share costs, we bring different comparative advantages to bear, we make progress faster in fundamental research, which is good for everybody. We collaborate with Russia on the Arctic. There's hardly any use having an 8-nation Arctic Council if Russia isn't part of it, because Russia owns about half of the Arctic. We collaborate with Russia on space. We would not have been able for some years now to get our astronauts to the International Space Station except on Russian rockets. I think that collaboration with countries, even countries that are in a somewhat adversarial position or a competitive position with respect to the United States in a number of domains, that collaboration continues to make sense when it's in the mutual interest. And I think it also builds relationships that can become extremely important diplomatically when people who have been collaborating end up in power in both places. And I could tell hours of stories about this. I know, Bill, you know the stories, where I started working with Evgeny Velikov on fusion energy collaborations in 1971. And in the 1990s, Velikov and I were the co-chairs of a joint presidential commission advising the presidents of Russia and the United States on how to manage plutonium. And we've been working together for 25 years at the time that happened. That enabled us to make recommendations which were accepted by both sides and were important. Any number of stories like that can be told, where people engaged in science and technology cooperation end up in positions of influence, and the fact that they know each other, they trust each other, they respect each other, leads to possibilities for progress that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Looks like we have time for one more, maybe, huh?
Well, thank you again for a beautiful talk, wonderfully organized and informative. I wanted to add a couple of points. When we created the Congressional Science and Technology Fellow Program, which led to the general AAAS programs in the executive branch and even the judicial branch, one of the explicit motivations was to broaden the career opportunities for PhD scientists and engineers. And at the same time, we also started the program of independent studies by the American Physical Society and others because the Nixon administration wasn't doing them. As you said, all of that was destroyed by Nixon after the '72 election. And that also was seen as an explicit method of broadening, deepening the understanding of scientists and engineers for many different areas than they had done research in. And of course, through many different agencies, including the National Academies, one can become educated and play an important role in that. But I wanted to add a different perspective. Just in the last few years, we're starting to hear very alarming reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and other organizations that are looking at the way the world is changing. I found out some time ago that if you graph the use of almost any resource starting around 1800, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the doubling time is about 30 years. It's true for example, fossil fuels. What I think that means is that we have exactly one generation at most to bring this exponential growth under control. We scientists understand that exponential growth cannot continue in a limited environment, but the general public doesn't. And it is extremely important that we get across the fundamental idea that we have to make fundamental changes.
Right.
We have to do it soon.
I agree. I have another talk about that, but but Joel, thank you for those comments. Joel Premack, who's been a towering figure in science, technology, and public policy for about as long as I have, which is a long time. I think we probably met in the early 70s. Yep, there you go. All right.
Well, thank you very much, John. It was
My
exceptional.
pleasure.